But hi everyone, thanks for joining us for today's webinar. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. My name is Nell Thompson and I'm the Secretary of the Australian Institute of Animal Management, and I'll be hosting the webinar for you today. I've been on the AIM committee since 2013 and I'm also the coordinator of the National Getting to Zero program. The Australian Institute of Animal Management, or as we call it AIM, is the national peak body representing local government animal management officers. The AIM committee consists of a wide range of professionals engaged in various aspects of animal management, and AIM seeks to support those engaged in the business of animal management and the function itself by providing training and information, opportunities for networking and collaboration, and by encouraging the use of best practice policy and practices. AIM understands the significant pressures placed on local government and the related sector service providers when working in the companion animal management space. We welcome new members and people can join via our website at www.aim.org.au. So to our presentation for today, there will be around, I think Carmen said around 35 minutes of presentation, and then we will have open time for question and discussion once the presentation is concluded. And the recording of this webinar will be accessible via our website to all members to watch at any time. We're going to ask that everyone mutes themselves during the presentation itself. And if you have questions, you can start putting them in the Q&A section and we'll get through as many as we can at the end of the session. If you have quick questions that relate to your understanding of the content, put your hand up. There's a little button down the bottom of your screen there, and we're happy to answer them during the presentation. And if you have more questions or we don't get to yours during the question time, you can always send us a message to our Facebook page and we'll get to it that way. As always, please excuse any working from home background noises that may filter through. I have my dogs here with me as usual, and often they like to have a bit of a wrestle time just as I'm talking. I'm pleased to introduce Carmen Glanville as our presenter today. After several years working in animal shelters and seeing firsthand the impacts of animal mistreatment, Carmen was determined to build her skills so she could make a difference. So she went back to school and completed a Bachelor in Animal Science Management before pursuing a PhD in dog welfare and human behaviour change. Her work combines animal welfare science and psychology to better understand both sides of the human-animal relationship and its implications for animal welfare and management. So let's get started. Over to you, Carmen.
Thank you so much, Nell, and thank you for having me here today. Just also before we get started, oh, why are we not advancing? There we go. I'd quickly like to acknowledge that I'm presenting here from Wurundjeri land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of the traditional custodians of this land and of all the lands on which you're joining from here today. So first of all, before we kick off into the actual content, I think it's probably, while Nell has given a little introduction to who I am, it might be nice to also hear a little bit more about who I am and why you should be listening to me about any of this stuff. So I'm Carmen and I am a PhD candidate from the University of Melbourne. I've just 2 weeks ago submitted my PhD, so it's all done. Yeah, that's been a big thing. So my PhD research was all around animal mistreatment, looking at the prevalence of mistreatment within the community, community actions around mistreatment, and community attitudes, as well as then shifting through into trying to understand the drivers of care and owner care related behaviour in terms of dog welfare. So for that, obviously, you need to understand and look at human behaviour, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. But before I got into the whole academic space, as Nell mentioned, I had my start in shelters. So I worked at RSPCA Queensland as a customer service officer back in the day, doing all those things that we do in the shelter, adoptions and intake and all that sort of thing. So I have a good background in actual on the ground shelter issues and management. And then also in between my undergrad and my PhD, I worked at RSPCA Victoria in their policy and prevention department. So I was a research officer. I worked on lots of different things, policy, campaigns, and that sort of thing. But one thing that I also worked on when I was there was the RSPCA's dam plan initiative, they called it, back in 2018, when the dam plans were undergoing, you were doing your reviews of the dam plans, and RSPCA was trying to get some particular initiatives into those dam plans. So maybe I engaged with some of you, I'm not sure, it was a while ago now, but yeah, we tried to engage and collaborate with different AMOs to try and understand some of those challenges. So I do have a bit of knowledge of the work that you do in the animal management space. But I will also preface today by saying that I recognize that academia is not the reality of day-to-day animal management. And while I will be talking about some of the learnings that we have from academia, it's your job to see how those concepts and learnings can be applied to your position, and this because you're the experts in animal management, right, in your jobs day to day. So I want to provide you with some new information, hopefully, and see how you can apply that to your position. So I would love it if we could share this at the end. So if there's a particular concept or thing that sparks an idea, or maybe even you resonate with something that you've maybe actually already been doing, but it's perhaps being described in a different way, and maybe you can even share that. Would love to share at the end and learn from you all and see how we can apply these concepts in this setting. So with that, let's get into it. So really, in a simplistic sort of way, we can think of animal management and animal welfare as existing on a sort of spectrum from very bad right through to very good. So you've got so many different issues that we face in both animal welfare and animal management. And really, the one common denominator in the vast majority of issues we have with animals isn't with the animals. It's human behavior. And I'm sure you all are very familiar with that concept, having to deal with owners and every day. So it follows then that human behavior change is quite likely our best avenue to improve the lives of animals. I don't know why it's doing that strange mergy thing across the slides, but we'll go with it. Anyway, so to do this, to achieve human behavior change, we can use these things called behavior change interventions. So what do I actually mean by a behavior change intervention? Well, essentially, it's any sort of coordinated set of activities designed to change a specific behavior pattern. So really, any concerted effort to change behavior, human behavior. So this can come in all shapes and sizes, from something as simple as a pamphlet that we just give out with some information, right through to multi-level community programs that, you know, incorporate social marketing and support things and all sorts of things. So really, as AMOs and as animal management professionals, a lot of what you do day to day is behavior change interventions, because this is a behavior change intervention. This is a behavior change intervention. And this is a behavior change intervention. It's all designed to change owners' behaviors in some way, or influence owner behavior in some way. So if you're already doing all these things out in the field, why should we care about academia or the science side of things? Well, behavior change science can help us to with frameworks for designing and evaluating interventions. And it also helps us to better understand the mechanisms at work and the psychology behind things. So ultimately, we can improve our efficacy and generally progress the field. So behavior change as a science or as a discipline is really quite prolific in other fields, particularly health psychology, in terms of they're trying to change behaviors around preventable disease. So some of the common ones are obesity or diabetes or smoking, things like that. And there's a lot of work done in those fields. But unfortunately, in the animal-related settings, it's still very much a fledgling academic field. As I mentioned, there's a lot of good work that you're all doing day to day out there in the field. But academically, from a science side of things, it's still fairly young. And now, just to demonstrate this, we conducted a systematic review of published behaviour change interventions in any animal care or interactive setting. And this is actually how Nell got onto me and invited me to speak today, was because of this paper. So we went through all the literature trying to find any sort of behaviour change intervention for any species, any type of behaviour, so long as it related to caring for animals or interacting with animals. And after screening 1,500 papers, there was only 47 studies that we could find that actually implemented some sort of animal-related behaviour change intervention. So this just goes to show how young this field is compared to, say, health psychology, in which there's thousands and thousands and thousands of papers, probably hundreds of thousands of papers on interventions. But the good news is that we can borrow from these more advanced fields to inform our work, particularly when it comes to the process of design and evaluation, which aren't necessarily content specific. So one of the things we can borrow is this. This is Abraham and Denford's 10-task guide to best practice, design and evaluation of behaviour change interventions. And this guide itself is actually based off a process called intervention mapping by Bartholomew and Associates as well. It's kind of an operationalized version of the intervention mapping approach. So this is one of those things that we can take from health psychology, but it's still very much applicable to our field. So I think this is a great tool for you to take away and help you to start thinking about the process that we need to go through for designing or thinking about interventions. Now, that review paper I mentioned before, we actually used this 10-task guide as a sort of framework to assess various elements of those 47 papers in our field to see how we're tracking and where we can improve. So we looked at a whole range of different things, which I won't go into today because I don't want to overload you with too much information. I want you to take away some really key things that can start you off on this journey. So today we're going to have a look at these 3 design elements that I think are really transferable to your sort of design day-to-day animal management and communication programs, but also really important as well if you are wanting to develop more extensive behaviour change interventions too. And also we're going to have a quick look at some evaluation things. So let's jump straight into things. So really a crucial first step in intervention design involves really clarifying how behaviour change is going to solve the problem that you have, and precisely identifying the targets of change. And that's why we've got a little target up there in the corner. In other words, we need to figure out who needs to change what behaviour patterns in what context to bring about your desired outcome. So there's 3 main things there that need to be defined. Firstly, we need to specify our target behaviour. What is it that you actually want people to do? And we need to be really quite specific about this. The more specific, the better. And we'll talk about this a bit in a sec. Secondly, we need to identify our intervention targets, intervention content. So these are usually the antecedents or drivers of behavior. And these may be things like knowledge or attitudes or skills. And again, we'll talk about more in depth about that in a minute. And finally, the target audience as well. Now, we're not going to talk too much about this today. There's more on it in the paper if you'd like to check out the paper. But we do need to be specific about our target audience, because we know that people's motivations and the things that are driving their behaviour differ for different target audiences. It could differ between different regions, rural versus metropolitan, could even just differ between genders. So we need to be quite specific about our target audience and understand them. So with regards to the review that we did, we found that often in the animal-related behaviour change interventions that were published, the target behaviours were often really poorly defined, and even sometimes they weren't defined at all. So often they used broad categories of behaviour like responsible dog ownership or safe behaviour or improved handling, with really little explanation of what specific behaviours were involved and what they're asking for. And I know this can be really difficult, particularly when it comes to animal care, because there's so many different individual behaviours that contribute to appropriate care. I think perhaps it's maybe a little bit more defined when we're talking about animal management behaviours, so we could be quite specific about we want people to register their pet by April 10th or something like that. We can be nice and specific there, but sometimes it can be quite difficult to define our behaviours. But it's really important to specify and make these really specific, because it helps us to better identify the drivers of those specific behaviours, because different behaviours have different drivers. And also it really helps us with evaluating whether the intervention was actually successful, because if you don't define what you're trying to change, how can you evaluate whether it was successful in making that change? Pretty straightforward. So then moving on to content, most of the studies that we reviewed targeted general knowledge, which is great if a lack of knowledge is the driving factor of the problem. But many studies didn't actually do any preliminary research to check whether this was actually the case. They just assumed that if people know more, they would do more. And we know from a wide range of behavioural research, and I'm sure you know from your interactions with people, that just because they know they are supposed to do something doesn't mean they're actually going to do it. So because interventions are timely, take a lot of time and are very costly, it's really important that instead of just relying on common sense or based on our opinion or just what we've done in the past, it's really important to make sure we understand and are targeting the relevant drivers so that we're not wasting time and money on something that's not actually targeting the right things. And as I said, I'm not going to go into target audience today, but if you would like to learn more about that, you can check out the paper. So then, next stage, let's move on to theoretical frameworks. Now, I know that in itself might sound like a snooze fest or a bit intimidating, but bear with me, it's really quite helpful, because these theoretical frameworks assist us in identifying some of those change targets we were just talking about and thinking more broadly about the drivers of behaviour other than just knowledge. So there are so many different psychological models and theoretical frameworks out there. I think every psychologist wants to name a new model after themselves. But some of the most commonly used ones are here, like the theory of planned behaviour, the social cognitive model, et cetera, et cetera. So, and actually there's a fair bit of overlap between some of these as well. So something that I used to struggle with quite a lot was, oh my gosh, there's so many different models. How do I know which one to pick and which one's right? But what I've come to learn is that it's not about picking one off-the-shelf theory and making everything fit into that. It's about using these existing, tested, validated models to help us identify or think about different things that can be influencing things. And this helps us to identify the underlying mechanisms of change. So these mechanisms of change are the specific processes through which an intervention is expected to produce a change in the target behavior. So let me give you an example. So a mechanism of change could be that increasing knowledge about parvovirus is going to lead to people vaccinating their animals more. Or something like increasing people's empathy and connection with animals will reduce negative behaviors like hitting or slapping. So these are our mechanisms of change. And in our review, very few papers actually drew on theoretical frameworks to help identify these mechanisms of change. As I said before, most of them just focused on increasing knowledge without considering other potential drivers. So while knowledge might be a contributing factor, drawing on these psychological frameworks can really help us in identifying other factors as well, because usually it's a combination of things that's driving things. So we're going to have a quick look at one of these frameworks, which I think is particularly straightforward and intuitive and really helpful for this sort of first step at thinking about behavior and looking at behavior. And I think will be good for you to take away. So this is Mickey and Associates COM-B model. So the COM-B stands for those things on the screen there. Essentially, it says that a person's behavior is a product of three necessary factors: their capability to perform the behavior, their motivation to do so, and their opportunity to perform the behavior. So that's fairly straightforward, fairly intuitive, but we can look at this and break this down into a little bit more detail. So firstly, capability. We can talk about physical capability. So this might be people's skills or their abilities, proficiencies, and things, those physical things that they need to actually perform the behavior. Psychological capability is then your knowledge, but also things like memory and attention and decision processes and even behavioral regulation. So you can see more than just knowledge. We then have motivation, and my clicker is not working anymore. There we go. So motivation is split down into two. We've got firstly reflective motivation. So this includes things like our beliefs and attitudes, and that could be our beliefs in, about our own capabilities, sometimes called perceived behavioral control or self-efficacy. And then other things like roles and identities and intentions and goals and things like that. So these are your cognitive processes, your reflective motivations. And then you've got automatic motivations. So these are the things that we're not thinking about consciously, but these are automatic things like emotions and reinforcement and habits as well are a really important one there. Finally, you've got opportunity, and this is to do with the social and physical environment. So you've got your social opportunity, which are things like social pressures and norms, social structures and supports and that sort of thing. And then also the physical opportunity. So this is around your environmental context, your access to resources, resources themselves like cost and finances and that sort of thing. So you can see that this can really help us to just broaden our perspective and think, okay, other than just people need to know that they need to register their pet, what other things could be going on and what other things can we identify that we can target in an intervention program to try and bring about more effective behavior change interventions. Come on, move along. Not moving. There we go. There we go. All right. So that was our theoretical frameworks. Once we've identified our drivers that are important that we're going to target, then we need to identify how we're going to change them or how we're going to influence them. And this is where change techniques come in, behavior change techniques. So the reason I've got a little beaker up there in the corner is because these are often called our active ingredients of our intervention. It's still not clicking. There we go. Active ingredients of our intervention. So these are the specific strategies or activities used to bring about that mechanism of change we talked about before. So, for example, if we identified that people's attitudes towards the behavior was a problem, then an appropriate behaviour change technique would be providing participants with evidence about the consequences of that behaviour, which has a tendency to change attitudes. Now, we're not going to talk about a lot of specific techniques today, because there are these big taxonomies of change techniques. So there's ones like the Mickey one, which I've got up here, which has 93 different behavior change techniques in it. And that's just the list of them. It actually goes into detail of what they all involve and what you need to do them. And there's also the Niddle et al. One, which is too big, 123 individual techniques to put on a screen. So I've included the link to it down the bottom of the slide there. I assume I'll be able to give you these slides afterwards. But these are fantastic tools for us to go, okay, we've got our change targets, what we've identified needs to change. Now let's go to the taxonomy and see what sort of techniques we can use to bring about a change in that driver. So just quickly, some of them, just to give you an idea of the sorts of things we're talking about, could be goal setting or problem solving, modeling the behavior through, important people, practice, social support, changing the environment, making things easier for people to access, a whole range of different things that we can do. But the important thing that we need to keep in mind is we can't just go and choose all the different techniques from these things because, oh, that sounds good. We need to map it back to those underlying mechanisms of change. What's the thing that's driving this behavior? And then choosing appropriate ones to bring about the change. Now, I'd like to be able to tell you that in the review we were able to identify the most effective behavior change techniques for animal-related settings. But unfortunately, we had a pretty difficult time even identifying the change techniques that we used because the actual content of the interventions was pretty poorly described and sometimes not even at all. Sometimes they didn't even really describe what they did. So this is quite problematic scientifically because we can't then know what worked and we can't then apply that in other settings. So while you're not all working in academia or anything, I think it's a great idea to start adopting a sort of shared language and a way to explain what you did so that other people can also adopt that with fidelity and be effective. Oh, I didn't advance my slides before. There you go. Okay, so that's our change technique. So we're done with the design stage of things. We're now just going to have a quick look at evaluation because this is really important. Essentially, evaluation tells us if what we're doing is worthwhile, and that's important when it comes to resources. So firstly, there's two sort of broad types of intervention evaluation. Firstly, there's outcome evaluation. So this is essentially about efficacy. Did the intervention work? And if so, how well? Then we also have process evaluation, which is about the context and process of intervention delivery. So was it delivered as planned? How much did each participant get? How many people were reached and so on. So today we'll just have a look at outcome evaluation, but process evaluation is really important as well to ensure things are going smoothly. So outcome evaluation, what sort of outcomes should we really be evaluating? Well, the primary outcome, what we call the primary outcome of a behavior change intervention is, lo and behold, the behavior itself. But there's other levels of outcomes that can be important too. So secondary outcomes are those resulting from the target behavior at the individual level. So in our field, this would be outcomes for the animal mainly, such as their behavior, welfare, and that sort of thing. Then there's also tertiary outcomes. And this is at a group or a population level. And these might look at changes in the incidence of something over time or economic impacts or, rates of registration, rates of stray intake and that sort of thing. And then finally, we also have interim outcomes. So these are the antecedents or the drivers, like your knowledge and your attitudes and skills. And evaluating them helps to provide insights into the underpinning mechanisms of how the intervention worked, not just if it worked. So the important thing to remember here is that only by evaluating all levels, or at least the first 3, depending on your aims, can we really truly say that causal pathways have been demonstrated. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a second to illustrate this. With regards to our review, this was very rarely done. So I just thought I'd show you a couple from that review to illustrate. And I'll preface this by saying that this isn't a criticism of these studies, but just things that we can learn from and improve on. So the most commonly used evaluation measures in the review that we saw were interim outcomes. So things like knowledge or attitudes. And that's understandable because these things are quite easy for us to assess with questionnaires and surveys and that sort of thing. But it relies on the assumption that this would then translate into the behaviour. But often they didn't actually measure the behavioural change. So we don't actually know if it worked. So a really good example of this is the Blue Dog interactive CD, which was designed to improve children's dog safety knowledge and ultimately reduce dog bites. And while 2 studies were conducted assessing interim outcomes only, that is the knowledge of the children, and they deemed the intervention successful because it did improve knowledge. Excellent, wonderful. But a 3rd study then showed that this increasing knowledge didn't actually translate through to safe behavior around dogs. So was it really successful? I'd probably say not. Another important thing to think about with this sort of thing is that it would have been really nice to assess tertiary outcomes. So their overall aim was to reduce dog bites, right? So it would be really good to have some sort of evaluation of the prevalence of dog bites in the communities that they did this in. At the other end of the spectrum, another study was aiming to increase animal adoptions through a shelter volunteer training program. So they were trying to improve volunteers' animal handling and training skills, and they thought that that would improve animal behaviour and then ultimately increase animal adoptions as a result. So that was the causal pathway. And they did indeed see an improvement in animal adoption rates, which is great. And they had shorter lengths of stay as well, which is awesome. But they didn't appropriately evaluate either the volunteer behaviour or the animal behaviour. So really, we can't actually say that the increase in animal adoptions was a result of the program that changed volunteer behaviour, because there could be a whole range of external factors or other factors that could influence adoption rates at that particular time, other than this pathway. So really what I'm trying to say here is that evaluating different levels of the outcome evaluation is really critical in demonstrating these causal relationships, understanding how the intervention worked, and whether it's the actual thing that's leading to the outcome that you're seeing. So that was a lot of information. Let's quickly summarize what we've talked about today. So firstly, we talked about change targets. We're talking about identifying our target behaviours, our drivers of behaviours, and appropriate target audiences. Secondly, we talked about theoretical frameworks, and these help us to identify target behaviour, the drivers of the behaviour, and that COM-B model is the one that we talked about, and is a really good first step when thinking about behaviour. We then talked about change techniques. These are our active ingredients in the intervention, and we've got these big taxonomies of them that can help us to identify appropriate techniques, so long as they're mapped back to those drivers that we identified in step 2. And finally, we had a quick look at evaluation and saw some examples of why different levels of evaluation are important to evaluate to actually show a causal pathway. So I hope that's been some interesting new information for you, or perhaps reimagine some of the things you already do. I'd really love to hear over to you. What have you heard today that really resonates with your role as an AMO, or where can you see something being applicable to your role, or any questions as well that you may have?
Yes, please. Anybody with any questions, please go ahead and either ideally pop them in the Q&A, and then we can address them that way. I think that was a fantastic brief overview of really, really meaty topics that really are just so applicable to everyday operations in animal management, and that we're really only coming around to acknowledging and addressing now. So very, very timely presentation. And I also wonder, Carmen, where you think that behaviour change, so we've talked about behaviour change from the other side of the fence, so from the outward looking perspective. Obviously, we're wanting to change behaviour of the community. We want to help them be what we need them to be to, you know, to fulfil our needs from local council or whoever it might be. But flipping that around and looking at behaviour change from within, and how we can change our behaviour with our approaches to these things. How much of the equation, for example, do you think that is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to start anything new or to change our approach to things is always like, it's just inherently behavior change, right? Like we're humans and we need to change our behavior. That it's just so applicable and so central to everything that we do. I guess it really depends on, it depends on the sorts of things that you're talking about. So if you're talking about changing our approach to animal management in terms of, you know, do we need to be having more of an enforcement role versus a educational role, if that's the sort of thing you're thinking about. I think there's other fields that we can kind of learn from in that sense, like the shift in policing and that sort of thing, from that more punitive approach through to a more community development, community support approach. I mean, I'm not an expert in that particular area, but I think it makes sense that having good relationships with animal management officers and creating a community approach as opposed to a punitive approach is, you know, personally, I think that's definitely a positive thing. But as I said, I'm not the expert in that. But of course, that requires a huge shift in attitudes and approaches and stuff within the animal management profession itself, which, you know, there's a whole body of disciplines on change management and all that sort of stuff as well. So
it's such an interesting space, isn't it? I mean, it's as you've discovered, there's not been much going on from a research perspective, and I think it's about time. Because this is really important stuff for our communities, you know, sort of as a whole, pet owners and non-pet owners as well. I've got a question here from Erin. I work directly with dog owners and I acknowledge that change is not always possible. However, educating these owners about animal welfare is where I do see change. Sometimes they just don't know until they know. Isn't that like all of us? We don't know what we don't know. It's then that they ask the critical questions like, how can we change things for our dog?
Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of speaks to the last study of my PhD, where the last two really. So I was really interested in this individual level drivers of care. What makes some dog owners provide really good care and have really good welfare for their dogs, and what makes others not. And really, you know, we know that there is quite extensive dog welfare problems in the community, just at that sort of middle level, like not even your cruelty and neglect, like just your everyday, you know, suboptimal care sort of thing. And so because we know that's so prevalent, the sorts of people that we were able to recruit for our surveys and that sort of thing are going to be those, it's going to capture those people who do have some sort of problems. And what I found was that, you know, I was looking at this concept of duty of care and different sorts of beliefs and attitudes. And really, you know, what I found in both my interviews and surveys was that people had a really high level of duty beliefs. They had strong feelings of moral obligation towards their dogs. But where I found there to be lacking was this concept of problem awareness. So that they're not actually understanding their dog's welfare state on a day-to-day basis, or how their dog how their dog reacts to different things. And, you know, that comes back to some very simple things like understanding dog body language and things like that, which, you know, it may sound really simple, but unless we can read what our dogs are telling us, then, you know, we're not going to be able to change our behavior or not be motivated to change our behavior because we don't see that there's a problem. So yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
That's exactly right, isn't it? I mean, if you don't know what you're looking at, then it's not possible to be aware of it. And it's funny, you know, once you become aware of things, it's like even if you get a new car and suddenly you see them all over the road, and you're like, wow, I've never even noticed them before.
Absolutely.
But now, because I've got one that's relevant to me and I know about it, and look at them all, you know.
Yeah, that attention.
Okay. Question from Anne. How do you suggest AMOs get senior management support to introduce changes?
Oh, that's a hard one. That's difficult because I know the struggle. When I was trying to really kind of push this more behavior change approach at a particular animal welfare organization, often, your senior management doesn't see the value in that, or see that it's going to take more time. That's all right, and it's going to take more time. It may be more costly to begin with because you're doing more initial work, but then really that if it's more effective in the long run, then those things balance out. And the problem we have in the animal related settings is that we don't have a lot of existing evidence of how these things work, that prevention is better than a cure in this particular setting. In your other health psychology and stuff, you can go look at how many millions of dollars we're saving on prevention than enforcement or management. So I think that is a really tricky one. I don't have any magic bullet answer for that. But I do think management often respond to evidence and numbers and hard facts and that sort of thing. And so if we can draw more from examples and show why these things are important, then hopefully that might shift things a little bit.
It's really the best place to start, isn't it? That evidence-based approach.
Yeah.
And working with people rather than against them, if you like.
Exactly. And taking them along for the journey as opposed to just saying this is what we need to do.
Yeah. And it's finding out what people's barriers are on their side of the fence as well. Like we can assume that we know what's happening, in someone's life, but we don't always know. We don't know where they are in their career, what's happened in the past, all those sorts of things. So
absolutely. And even on that, you can take the COM-B model and go, okay, my manager, do they not have the knowledge about this? Are they not motivated to it? How can I provide more motivation? How can I change the environment to make this easier? Those sorts of things. So
how do we make the water flow easier?
Exactly.
Erin's back with a comment, a lot of that is tied to individual human characteristics such as compassion and how the dog ranks in their world. For example, it's just a dog as opposed to he's a family member.
Absolutely, Erin. And that's really important. And there has been some good work done on those sort of human characteristics around, you know, even basic things like gender, that we do see more empathy and compassion within people identifying as female than male, and, you know, personality characteristics and that sort of thing. All really important stuff to understand. I guess my perspective on that is, though, that I want to focus on the things that I can change. So as opposed to like personality, which is pretty set, I want to focus on the things that could be influenced. So those sorts of things around beliefs of, you know, it's just a dog, or think, you know, it doesn't matter. They are things we can change. They're attitudes and beliefs, and, you know, they can be tricky to change. But that's where we need to really understand the appropriate behaviour change techniques to really bring about that change. And I think some of that comes from providing evidence around, you know, the capabilities of animals and their cognitive capabilities. We know that that's a big thing that influences people's attitudes, is their belief in the animal mind. If they think, I mean, I personally don't think it's the right way to think about things, but we know that people think, okay, it's smart, so it is worthy of me giving it attention or whatever. So we can draw on those sorts of things, but it's difficult to do. I think you have more of an opportunity to do that in this sort of one-on-one space that you work with as AMOs in interacting with people. But, you know, it's difficult to get widespread change when you're working one-on-one. So that's why we need to balance, you know, sort of community level interventions with individual level interventions as well.
Yeah. And Claudia is here with a comment. Thanks so much, Carmen. Just wondering about any knowledge or ideas around costs being prohibitive for most owners to access pet healthcare, and de-sexing being unaffordable for most people. How do you work towards human behaviour change if owners cannot access the things they need to be, as most people label them responsible? I know I've got a good answer for that one, but I'll let you go for it now. Well, look, we need to, if we have needs of the pet owning community, so as a sector, whether it's local government, not-for-profit, animal welfare, whoever it might be, then we need to do what we can to help them be the owners that, or caretakers that we need them to be. And so we do know that cost is a factor. We do know that accessibility to care, whether it's just basically transporting the pet, there is a factor. And so there are plenty of things that we can do within that space, make it free or very low cost. We can provide transport, we can provide carry cages, you know, whatever the barriers are, if we identify them through the work that you've suggested, through that stepwise process, then we can identify those barriers and implement strategies to overcome them, often fairly easily, to get that job done. And then, as you've said, it ends up being cheaper for us in the long run.
Yeah, that's it. And I think something that comes up often when you have these sorts of talks about subsidizing vet care or de-sexing, that sort of thing, something I often hear is, oh, but that means they won't value it, so they won't, you know, keep doing it. We don't have any evidence to suggest that that's the case. I feel like people often, if you are offering a service for free, that they do value that, that they are thankful for that, and they will value that moving forward. It builds a strong relationship with that organization. They feel bought in, and they're more likely to seek help later on before it gets too bad, which is when then cost becomes really prohibitive. But B, they can also, it's kind of modeling behavior as well. You're showing them what needs to be done, and they will see the benefits of that throughout the animal's life. And then, you know, when they have another animal, you know, maybe they'll be able to do it themselves. But I think it's all well and good for people often say, well, if you don't have the money, you shouldn't have the pet. yeah, okay, I get that. But
Look how well that's worked for us.
we have such a culture that, you know, it's my right to have a pet. You know, it's just a part of our Australian culture that you should have a pet. We're not going to change that overnight. So, you know, I feel like that it's probably easier to try and support people. Yeah.
And I think that's the approach that we've come to for people with kids.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
We don't say to people, oh, you don't have any money or capacity or a car or whatever, so you shouldn't have children. The government has implemented an array of strategies and resources to help people be great parents and to intervene when necessary, if necessary. But you know, that's the way that approach has been, and I think we need to consider that, you know, more strongly in this field as well. Jess has got a comment here. I can recommend for managers struggling to get on board, starting with a trial. Excellent suggestion. The pilot project. An important behaviour change concept is that people have to believe their actions will make a difference. So rather than asking for long-term change and funding in the first instance, go back to the model of trialling and intervention, checking and evaluating, then scale up once you've got evidence that it's worth further investment. Hallelujah, Jess. Excellent. I absolutely agree.
Yeah. Well done.
That's the way to do it.
Fantastic.
And Craig from Wodonga, just a comment, this is a good tool and more valuable when putting forward a business case for funding grants or for a business case to increase staffing or to implement education programs. But implementing behaviour change in the community is a challenge. I'm always told by management, show me the data and we may give you the money or the resources to help implement the change. The community response is what we do get for our money as we pay our rego fees, so give us something back. And I think Jess, in her comment there with the pilot project, just, you know, sort of covered that, Craig, that the pilot projects are an excellent way to get some evidence on the board, to get some, you know, ticks on your page, and then you can show you know, what it's going to mean moving forward. So yeah, I hope that that's helpful for you.
Also in terms of getting that data, thinking about the different levels of evaluation that we talked about, you know, you can start with like a small pilot trial thing with, you know, a small number of people and show some of those sort of preliminary or individual level changes and say, well, this is expected to then translate into these sort of tertiary outcomes, which is very beneficial for, you know, in terms of funding and that sort of thing. So, you know, start off earlier and you can then move through it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Claudia's comment, unfortunately, there are so many areas in New South Wales and nationally that have no options for people in these situations. And I agree.
It's a
really big issue here in Australia. We have lots of wide open space, not many people, and then not many resources. So we have these deserts of, you know, veterinary care or deserts of lots of things. You know, it's not just the animal care situation that people are struggling with in a lot of regions and, you know, districts and communities. So Claudia, if you've got something specific in mind, please reach out to me at secretary@aim.org.au. I'd love to chat to you further about that. Jane has made a comment in the chat. Problem awareness seems prevalent in a shelter environment. Poor or outdated procedures are contributing to stress and poor animal behaviour. But the people working in the shelter can't see they're contributing to the problem.
So that's a classic example of where, you know, knowledge is a factor, but there's so much more going on there as well. There's so many attitudes and deep held beliefs and values and that sort of thing that also need to change at the same time to actually bring about any sort of change in their behaviour. Because, you know, just telling them, well, this is how it needs to be done, not going to change anything, is it? So it's a really tricky one in the shelter environment, I know, because it's so you know, when you're in that environment, it is very raw and it is very, you know, close you hold your actions kind of close to your self-identity, and you're doing this to help and to further the animal welfare, but to accept that perhaps what you're doing isn't the best is really difficult in that situation.
And we've all been faced with, I think now in 2023, those moments where we've looked at new ideas and initially thought, oh, no, that's the wrong thing to do.
Absolutely.
That's the way I've been doing it is absolutely right. And then suddenly, evidence or someone we really respect, or we're forced to consider it a bit more, and suddenly we think, oh, what I've been doing actually is not the right way to be doing it, and it's very, very confronting. I can tell you that I change my mind all the time, because I'm always learning and I'm always taking on new ideas, and I think that's really how we need to be. We need to not clutch on to ideas or actions or protocols or policies, whatever it might be, and have open minds. And that is a distinctly uncomfortable place to be a lot of the time.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. And it is really, really difficult. So, yeah.
Well, on that note, I think we are just about on the hour, which is fantastic timing. Thank you so much, Carmen. I really appreciate it. I know with the conversation that we've had, everyone's really enjoyed it. Great comments in the chat. This is actually our last webinar for 2022. So I hope that people do get a bit of a break, and that you all have a stress and trouble-free fire season, flood season, whatever else is the situation where you are. But we hope to see you in 2023, and we may even have some news about in-person events. Who knows? It might be the year for it. But thanks very much for your attendance. As always, we appreciate it. And thank you again, Carmen, for your time. It's been a fantastic presentation, and we will pop it up on the website. People can use it as their staff training session, which is always handy. But yes, that's right, absolutely. This is the bonus of having it recorded. You can show it to whoever you need to. So take care, everybody, and thanks again. We'll talk to you all soon.
Pleasure. Thank you.